My name's Fergus Halliday and I'm a tourist guide here in Scotland. If you're interested in the history and the landscape of our country, then why not join me and I'll show you around. Today we'll be following in the footsteps of the ruthless, scheming families that inspired Game of Thrones, as well as cattle rustlers and brigands and the firebrand preachers of the National Covenant, as we follow the Thieves Road up into the Pentland Hills. When you're going off the beaten track, it's best to use a map, and the British Isles are some of the best map places on the face of the earth. So let's have a look at the OS map and see where we're going. We're starting today in the car park here on the western shore of Harperrig Reservoir. Our first leg is just a short one, down the path to the south and into the heart of the Cairns estate. From here we'll head east along the shores of the reservoir through the rest. Once we reach the dam at the far side, we'll pause for lunch. Well, I will. Don't let me stop you from snacking while I do the legwork. The area here is called Cairns, as in rocks, potentially because on the top of the two overlooking hills are prehistoric burial cairns. One of the earliest references to the name is in the late 14th century. The landowner of Cairns' only heir was a daughter, so he marries her to Stephen Crichton, a younger son of the powerful Crichton family that lives on the other side of the Pentlands. Stephen becomes Stephen Crichton of Cairns and adds the estate to the Crichton portfolio. The family has a fascinating history, so let's go explore it. In 1382, Stephen had a son, whom he named George, who eventually took over the family estate, and in 1440 built a sturdy tower house to keep the land safe. This tower house is in a very traditional Scottish style. You can see the thick, sheer rubble walls with the small windows and arrow slits. It makes it very defensible from both enemies and the cold, freezing Scottish winters. It's in an L shape. The addition that makes the sticky out bit of the L is known as a jamb. But the jamb here has collapsed, and the entrance into the tower has been remade out of the old kitchen fireplace. The functional tower house form has lasted for centuries, all the way to inspiring Charles Rennie Mackintosh and the birth of modernism. Now this is a tumultuous time in Scottish history. Just 3 years before the tower is built, King James I is assassinated in Perth. His wife Joan Beaufort escapes with his infant son James and crowns him king at 6 years old at Holyrood Palace. The void of power is filled by the most powerful noble in the kingdom, Archibald, the Earl of Douglas. Now, Scotland has its fair share of minority kingships, and each one is notorious for years of civil war and infighting, nobles competing for control. So perhaps, with the Douglas in charge, there might be some stability this time. He is the most powerful man in Scotland. He owns the majority of southern Scotland. He's descended from one of Robert the Bruce's most trusted warriors. But he dies. The new Earl of Douglas is still just a child himself, and he's in no position to take up the role of his father. So the void is filled by two other men, Alexander Livingston and William Crichton, the cousin of George Crichton from the tower over there. Now these men are not fond of one another, but they're willing to work together and do what it takes to maximise their power. Now the position of these two uneasy allies at the top of the pecking order in Scotland has only been precipitated by the death of the powerful Earl of Douglas. But his son is almost a man and poses a very serious threat to their power. So what do? They invite him and his brother to Edinburgh Castle on the 23rd of November 1440 to have dinner with King James. Sounds innocent enough, right? while they had other plans. No sooner had the dinner begun than in walk some men carrying the severed head of a black bull. Tossing it on the table, that is the signal, and the two young Douglases are dragged kicking and screaming from the tables out into the courtyard, where they're tried for treason and executed in front of the wailing young King James. This terrible event was known as the Black Dinner, and if that sounds familiar, George R.R. Martin has acknowledged it as the inspiration behind Game of Thrones' infamous Red Wedding. I guess that makes our Crichtons the Boltons? Or maybe even the Freys. Oh dear. Is it too late to go for a walk somewhere else? Yeah? Okay. Moving on. The ealdom of Douglas then passes to their great uncle, a man named James the Gross, as in the French, in fact. But he forms a triumvirate with Livingston and Crichton, which suggests perhaps he wasn't entirely innocent in the deaths of his great nephews. But the Douglases just can't catch a break, and James the Gross dies, leaving Crichton and Livingston to fight it out between them, which of course they do. Livingston takes the more traditional approach, besieging castles where the Crichtons are holding, but the Crichtons take a more lateral approach. William Crichton arranges the marriage of King James to Mary of Guelders from the powerful kingdom of Burgundy, bringing power and influence to the Stuart family, but also quite a large dowry and a retainer that Mary of Guelders requires, which leaves the young King James in debt that he needs to call from somewhere. And so he takes it from the Livingstons, forfeits all of their lands and takes them as his own, leaving William Crichton, the Lord Chancellor of Scotland, the last man standing. With his powerful cousin William, the Lord Chancellor, our man George, over in the Tower, sees a meteoric rise. He's made the Sheriff of Linlithgow, the Keeper of Stirling Castle, and even Lord High Admiral in 1448. In this role, he builds Blackness Castle, the famous castle down on the shores of the Firth of Forth. If you're an Outlander fan, you may recognise it as Fort William, and if you've seen Outlaw King on Netflix, it's the prison where Robert the Bruce's wife is held, and it features in many other films. But George isn't just messing around with other people's families, he has his own too. He marries the daughter of William Douglas of Strathbrock, with whom he has a son, whom he names James. But you might notice that name, Douglas, and it doesn't go very well. Indeed, powerful cousin William lays waste to the whole lands of Strathbrock, burning everything he can find, including a farm run by monks. So George Crichton eventually marries another, the daughter of the Earl of Sportic, one of William Crichton's neighbours. George's son James has too much of his mother's family in him, and they don't get on at all. In fact, George moves to completely disinherit James of all the lands and titles that would come to him on his death. And he doesn't take this too lightly. While George is staying in Blackness Castle, James imprisons him there, and it takes the intervention of King James himself in order to get him free. They reach a compromise by which the only lands that James will inherit are some lands in Perthshire and Cairns over here. The rest, when George dies, all go to the king. But it's not just the Crichtons who are having trouble with the Douglases. King James is not a fan either, especially not when the 8th Earl of Douglas, the grandson of James the Gross, publicly declares an alliance with John MacDonald, the Lord of the Isles, the very troublesome semi-independent kingdom to the west. In order to solve their differences, King James invites the Earl of Douglas to Stirling Castle for dinner. You may remember the last time James II invited a Douglas over for dinner. It didn't go very well. And so the Earl of Douglas demands a letter of safe conduct, as well he should, which he gets. And so arrives for talks at Stirling Castle. Both men had been drinking quite heavily for most of the day, so as you can imagine, the talks go quite poorly. King James demands, point blank, that the Earl of Douglas renounce his alliance with John MacDonald. Of course, he refuses, and in his anger, James draws the dagger that he wears, marches straight up to him, and stabs him to death. But it wasn't just King James. As soon as he made the first move, his entire retinue jumped in with their own knives. In total, the Earl of Douglas was found with 26 stab wounds and his head cleaved in two with an axe. His body was tossed out of a window to the ground below, where it was to be discovered by his men. George Crichton, of course, was keeper of Stirling Castle at this time. We can be fairly certain that our man was one of those with a knife in his hand. James II had now gone through 5 Earls of Douglas, and they weren't too happy at this point, especially since the last one had been murdered in cold blood after being given a letter of safe conduct. So they rise in open rebellion. But James II, through his marriage to Mary of Guelders, received a huge amount of artillery, huge cannons, and the castles that the Douglas held were no match. They surrendered instantly. Douglas lands were forfeit, and once again, the Crichtons were the last men standing. Our protagonist, George Crichton of Cairns, died in 1454, and though he'd fought hard to inherit his birthplace, his son James eventually died in his lands to the north. James's son later sold the estate to the Tennant family, and it passed out of the Crichton control as the once powerful family began to diminish. The Lairds of Cairns were later known for their religious non-conformism and not attending the kirk properly, but we'll get more into that in the next video. The landscape has changed a lot since the 14th century. The reservoir was created in 1860 to meet the growing demand for clean drinking water in the city of Edinburgh as the population grew. You can see just how much the landscape has changed, and the tower would have stood just above a small burn, not a wide expanse of water. Rising just behind us in the hills, a spring feeds the reservoir, which drains out to become the Water of Leith, Edinburgh's hidden river. The Water of Leith has fueled the industry of the capital city for centuries. Over 22 miles long, it flows through Edinburgh, past the Inverleith quarry and the artisans' houses at the Stockbridge colonies, through the Dean village under the famous bridge designed by Thomas Telford. It fed the many mills that dotted the route since the corn mills established by the monks of Holyrood Abbey at Cannon Mills. It feels so remote, it's hard to imagine that in just half an hour I could be sitting in an artisan coffee shop in the new town sipping on a fancy tea, or more accurately, driving around in circles looking for a parking spot. As we look to the future, it's proposed to become a local nature reserve for the wildlife that calls it home. Many migratory birds stop here, gulls and wildfowl, geese and ducks. There are plenty brown trout that make it a popular fishing spot. But most special of all, it's home to the Eurasian otter, which has been far too elusive for this amateurish cameraman. And so, it's been a tumultuous history for this peaceful reservoir and unassuming medieval ruin. But in over 500 years, it never saw any military action. perhaps because the Crichtons preferred to stab you in the back rather than the front. Now, the estate is a wedding and events venue run on the farm, so finally, some 500 years later, the tower finally hears the sounds of happy families. After all that, we found a happy ending! Hooray! If you're enjoying this video as much as I'm enjoying making it, then please do give it a like below. And of course, we're only halfway through, so subscribe to make sure that you don't miss the second half. Once it's ready, I'll put it up here. For now though, I think it's time for lunch.